Kristopher Loewen, and this is Behind the Sermon, the podcast all about the art of preaching, from the twinkle of an idea to late nights writing to the time spent practicing, all the way up to that moment of truth on stage. This show attempts to pull back the curtain on the rocky and beautiful and terrifying and memorable process of creating the unique event in time known as the sermon. And in this episode, just like every episode, you get to hear a audio version of the sermon that I preached at the Redlands Adventist Church in Southern California, where I get the privilege and joy of serving as the lead pastor. And, as always on Inside the Sermon podcast, you'll get to hear my candid reflections about the many things that were overlooked and left out, the victories and the failures, and how I'd change it if I had it to do all over again. So thank you so much for joining me today, whether you're out on a run or you're cycling or commuting from one place to another, or you're just sitting, if you're sitting down in your lazy boy listening to this thing, just thank you for joining me and taking the time to spend it with me. Every week I invite those who are listening to offer me feedback, and we got some feedback this week that I'm going to incorporate today. So we'll see how it goes. But let's get at it. The first segment of every episode is entitled "Context is All." Context is all, and it's the segment where I explore a little bit about what we were trying to do with the sermon. If I was in a sermon series, what that's about, just sort of setting the context of what was trying to happen with this sermon. And on this particular week, it actually wasn't part of a series. You might remember that we finished the sermon series on calling, and I'm going to start a new one about the book of Mark, and that's going to start in September. Actually, one of our other pastors on staff is going to begin that, Pastor Chris. I'm excited to hear what he has to say, but that will be September 21, so that's next week. That one's going to start. And so, and this week, as it happened, this church, Redlands Church, is a family-oriented church, and one of the things that they do to lean into that is called Kids Church. It's the second Sabbath, the second Saturday of every month, and it is it's kind of, I don't know how you describe it. It's dramatic and fun and pretty and cool, and it's in our auditorium space, which is sort of like kind of has a feel of a theater with lighting and a stage and curtains and all that kind of stuff. And so it's a program designed for little kids. And anyway, so that happens at the same time. It happens at the 11 o'clock hour. And on that week, we take that opportunity to sort of build the 11 o'clock service, which is where I normally preach, kind of build it for the folks that will not be going over to Kids Church. It tends to be kind of a little bit of an older crowd, so we sort of do a classic old-time religion sort of worship service. And so anyway, I asked one of our retired pastors, who's an elder here, a member of the church, to preach over at the 11 o'clock service, because I wanted to be present for Kids Church. It was my first one here as a lead pastor. I wanted to see what happened and wanted to take part in it with my kids. And so we didn't have anyone scheduled to speak at Relevant, which is the 9:45 a.m. sort of young adult group. And so I volunteered to do that since I wasn't going to be speaking at the 11 o'clock hour. And so that's kind of how I ended up doing this one. So it's sort of a one-off, kind of a one-off sermon, sort of like a single album, or I don't know if it was a hit, but a one-hit wonder kind of thing. And this is a sermon that I adapted from some old material, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. but it's a sermon that I adapted from some old material on a sermon series that I had done back at my previous church in Walla Walla that was on the book of Philippians, the book of Philippians. So anyway, and like I said, we're going to be beginning. I'm going to be starting this new sermon series on the book of Mark, and so I spent most of my time this week in my sermon prep time, my studying time. I spent most of that working on future material. I went to I joke with some of my friends that I have, and now I'm joking with you. I guess we're friends, but I joke that I go on a nerd date with some of my pastoral colleagues. We go to a local library at a university that has resources that we don't have access to normally, online or in any other way. And so we meet up at the library and we study together, and then we go to lunch. And they don't call it a nerd date, but I call it that. And I think it's funny. Anyway, we've been doing this for a few months, and it's a great thing. So we did that this week. I worked that whole day at the library working on future sermons on the book of Mark, and the choice to not write something new for the relevant service was kind of a combination of that, leaning into what's going to happen next, because I don't preach again at Redlands Church until the 28th of September 2000. We're in the year 2019, in case you're listening somewhere in the future. It was good. Wrote that out, or kind of adapted that material, and I talk a little bit more later in the podcast about adapting material. But so my goal with this sermon, this is about Philippians chapter 3, and it's the passage where Paul talks about circumcision and beware of those dogs, the mutilators of the flesh. It's kind of a hardcore sermon text a little bit. And so my interpretation of the text and my presentation of the text was one where I wanted to challenge fundamentalism, challenge narrow religious ideology that sort of uses these certain religious markers as barriers for people to approach God. So I wanted to challenge that, yes, and sort of speak out against the ways that we use certain religious practices to like keep people out, or to keep the tribe pure, or whatever it happens to be that we're working on. So I wanted to make that challenge. But also, and this is sort of the more important part, I wanted to invite people to have some introspection and self-awareness about anything in their lives that can be held rigidly. And truly, I believe that we can hold any practice with rigidity, and I think that we can turn any practice into something that becomes a block, that becomes a stumbling block, to borrow again from Paul's words in other passages. And in the end, I think the challenge with the sermon is for us, and that was sort of the final line of it, is in the end, I wanted to challenge everyone in the room as individuals, but also as a collective that creates culture, to take it upon ourselves to be the sorts of people that would make the church inclusive. And so I closed with my own commitment of, I want to be someone who opens doors and not be a stumbling block. So this is a sermon that used doorways as a metaphor throughout. So it was a way to sort of talk about inclusion or exclusion. And I actually had a door on the stage. If you watch the YouTube version of this podcast, you'll get to see the video of the door. And I really liked. I was so happy that the creative team was able and willing to pull that off, and to find a stage door and get it up there. It worked perfectly. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So anyway, that's where I was going. I wanted to challenge fundamentalism, and also invite us to think about, how we are contributing to, or, working against having a culture of inclusion in whatever church community that we are a part of. Last week on the podcast, I asked for feedback regarding the format, and I had several great, sort of notes about how to do it, how to structure it, and specifically last week I asked for feedback on the order. My commitment, I would like to run the sermon as a part of this, but the truth is that some of you who are listening are people who are part of the Redlands Church congregation, and you've heard the sermon probably live, and then there's other people who are listening who are family or friends or people that have followed my work for a while, or just appreciate hearing the stuff that I have to offer or to share. And so you're listening in from afar and maybe haven't heard the sermon at all. And so there's sort of a balance as we have different audiences. And no matter what I choose in terms of format, somebody is going to be kind of like left out. And you're not going to get what... it's not going to be totally designed for you. So what I'm thinking about doing and what my latest suggestions have sort of offered is why don't I give the context, so do what I just did, and then roll the sermon, and then do the rest of the material after that. And then what I could do is I could share with you, like for example, this week, the sermon is 41.5 minutes long. And so if you fast forward on your podcast 41.5 minutes, that would put you at approximately, 53, right? About at 53 minutes. If you fast forward 53 minutes in, we should get, you should be able to just jump right back on the microphone therapist. So here is the sermon. Good morning. I get the opportunity to speak here at Relevant, and then our one of our retired pastors, he's kind of, we call it retired, but he works really hard. But Bill Tucker will be preaching over the way, and we'll kind of, as I understand it, sort of our tradition is to lean that 11 o'clock service on kids' church weekends a little more traditional, and so that will reflect that over there, what's happening there. So it's good to be with you today, and I love this sermon. In many ways, it's who I am as a person. It's who I see myself as a pastor. I want to talk about doors. Open doors and closed doors. I really love doors. I've loved doors for a long time. I find myself taking pictures of doors frequently. I follow the tag for a tag on Instagram for doors. It's really a great tag. There's all kinds of super cool. And I don't know if it's like that I'm fascinated by what's behind the doors, if there are things that are hiding behind the doors, or if it's like the language of doors opening and doors closing. I don't know what exactly it is. But I have many pictures in my own files of doors that were important for me at personal moments in my life, actually. There's all kinds of important doors from specific memories. The one on the right is actually in my office. It hangs up on the wall. There's all kinds of important doors to me. I don't know, maybe it's because I liked, there's jokes about doors that I like. Like, when is a door not a door? When it's a jar! Well done. It's a famous one, right? So, but I want to talk about doors today because I think it's a useful metaphor for understanding the text that we're going to read, all right? Are you with me? So that's where we're going to head. This morning, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do 4 things, and I have kind of a roadmap for you up on the screen. We're going to do 4 things. First, we're going to read a text. We're going to read Scripture. And I'm going to give you some background context. This is going to be the longest part of the sermon. This will take up the more time than the rest of them. Then we're going to look at some ancient history, all right? And then we're going to combine these things together and make an observation. We're going to put the pieces together. And then finally, we're going to end with a twist, all right? We're going to end with a twist. So first, we're going to look at Philippians chapter 3. So if you have your phones, if you have your Bible app or whatever, pull that out. You can follow along. We're going to keep referring to that all the way through. I do have it up here, but, if you want to follow along, Philippians 3, I'm just going to read it. Further, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you. Watch out for those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh, for it is we who are the circumcision, we who serve God by his Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, who put no confidence in the flesh. Although I myself have reason for such confidence, if someone thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything loss because of the surpassing worth and knowledge of Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ. A lot of stuff there. So, some observations, some context. Paul is writing this letter from prison, right? And this is to the Philippian church. The Philippian church is Philippi was a city in Greece, northeastern Greece. It's not on an island. It's a part of the mainland, but it's right, kind of near the beach, northeastern Greece. So sort of toward Turkey, right? On your way out to the east. And Paul, in this section, is writing about a problem that this community is experiencing. And this is not a new thing, even in this letter. The letter of the Philippians is full of Paul addressing different issues that were happening within this congregation, right? It's a series of problems that he's addressing. And so the problem in this case was a problem that arose between people who had grown up as Jews, right? People who had grown up as Jews, who had grown up Jewish and with all those systems and customs, and who later came to follow Jesus and to believe that he was the Messiah. It's a conflict between that group of people and those who had grown up not Jewish, who were Gentile. The label was Gentile, right? So if you grew up not Jewish, what Jewish people called you was Gentile. So they grew up in some other culture, some other tradition, some other religion. But then because Jesus' message was so radically inclusive, it compelled people who were not even part of that same religion to follow him. And so you have this convergence. Are you guys with me? You have this convergence of people who grew up Jewish who are following Jesus and people who did not grow up Jewish. And so inevitably they get together and there's conflict. There's questions that arise. And specifically in this passage, it's questions about certain religious rituals and what you have to follow, what you have to do. And of course, the Jewish Christians, the people who'd lived their lives as Jews, they had a long, vivid, vibrant history with God, right? All the stories in the Old Testament, they were their stories. All the stories about Moses and about Abraham and so on, they were all their stories. All the rituals and all the customs and all the traditions, they owned them. They followed them. That was part of the way that they saw the world. And this is where the rubber meets the road in our little conflict in the book of Philippians. Apparently, there had been a subgroup of Jewish Christians, right? And they had been traveling around the region like happy missionaries, right? And they would, knock on doors and they would bring a message. They would bring a message of hope. Not really a message, but they were bringing a message to the Gentile Christians, the people that were not Jew. They were bringing a message. They were traveling around from place to place. And we don't totally know if this is a group that was centered in the church at Philippi or if it was a missionary group. I like to think of it as a missionary group, and they were spreading their wonderful message around. And so they would come to the door and they would say, listen, we are so glad that you've come to know Jesus. We're so glad that you've come to know our Messiah, our Savior. It is a beautiful, amazing thing. It's brilliant. We are excited for you. We're excited that you want to give your life to him, that you want to follow him. But listen, we go way, way back with God. We have this we've known him for a long time, much longer than you have known him. We have some privileged information that it's not your fault that you don't know about it, but we have some special privileged information about what he wants and how he wants us to live and what he wants us to do and stuff. And, like we said, it's not your fault that you don't know about it, but that's why we're here. That's why we're here at your door. We want to tell you about it. But here's the thing. At this point, you're followers of Jesus, but you're kind of like tier 2 followers. I mean, we're kind of, because we got the traditions and we got this, we know the rules and all that. But and you guys are following Jesus, so it's great. You're included, but you're kind of here, right? But let me tell you, you don't have to do all the stuff to get up here where we are. All you have to do is there's this little operation, and it's only the guys that have to do it. Don't worry about it. We don't have anesthetic. We haven't invented that yet, but we do have a stick, and you can bite on it, and it's just a quick snip and a cut, and then it's over. And once they all do that, then you're in. You're with us. Tier 1 remnant followers. You're with us. You're on the inside. Are you guys with me? You're with me, right? What do you say? Give it a try. Give it a try. So, all of this might lead you to ask, why is Pastor Kristopher speaking about circumcision at a worship service that's entitled Relevant? And that would be a great question, right? It would be I understand that question. And what does circumcision have anything to do with doors? Again, another really good question, and I promise you that we'll get there, all right? This one preaches. Just stick with me for a moment if you're worried about it. But I want you to imagine for a moment what it might have felt like to be one of these Gentile Christians at that time. What might had it felt like to have those folks come to your door and deliver this message? What could have it felt like? I imagine, man, it may have felt lonely and maybe a little bit scary and exposing and shameful and confusing. I mean, they weren't insiders, right? They didn't know any better. There's a certain degree to which it's true. They didn't have that history with God. They didn't have all of those past gifts. They didn't have control. They hadn't been identified as the chosen people for millennia, right? They didn't have control. And here they are. They're led to believe that the door for them is locked. They can't get in. The door is locked, and the key is horrendous, right? And it's being held by someone who's callous and who can't relate to how it may have felt to be in that place. And I think it's against this that Paul is reacting in Philippians chapter 3. And he gives a really strong warning, and he uses really strong language. He says, beware of those dogs, those evildoers, and the mutilators of the flesh. And each of these words, they're loaded with connotations. These are the Greek words, kunas, kaukos, ergatos, and katatomein. I like to say katatomein. Would you guys say that with me? Katatomein. It has lots of T's. It's kind of it's a fun word to say. So these are three really strong words in the Greek. And in each of them, Paul is using them in sort of a traditional Hebrew way, which is to do a reversal. So you kind of bring up one idea, and then you turn the tables on it, right? So that each one of them is a reversal. The first one is kunas, and it's the word for dogs. And dogs, even today in English, if you call someone a dog, that's kind of a derogatory, oh, that dog. You could use that word in lots of different ways, but it can be a derogatory thing, and very much so in Greek. And in fact, it was not uncommon for Jewish people to call non-Jewish people kunas, dogs. And so Paul here is turning the table on that word, and he's using this word that some of the insiders might have used to talk down to outsiders. He's pointing that back at them. And he says, you guys think of yourself as this clean inside group, but actually you're outsiders. The second one echoes a similar reversal, kaukos, ergatos, workers of iniquity. It's this phrase, these two words are used in the Greek version of the Psalms. It's called Septuagint, right? Kunas ergatos, workers of iniquity. We see that in the English version over and over and over, this phrase, in the Psalms especially, the workers of iniquity. It talks all different about them. God is going to visit them, or God's going to save them, or whatever. It's a theme, and it's the enemies of God. And so again, the second word labels this group who think of themselves as insiders as in fact the enemies of God. Then he uses this third word, katatomein, and it literally means to cut up into pieces. This is the word we get for, we translate mutilators, to cut up into pieces. And it's actually a play on words. It's a play on the Greek word for circumcision, which is peritomein. It's to cut around. And we don't have to talk any more about that. But it's a play on words. That's why he's using it here, katatomein. And so rather than acknowledging this group as doing this important religious ritual, this very delicate and careful procedure, right? Paul says, no, it's mutilation, katatomein. You're cutting up into pieces. You're destroying, right? So you get the picture, yeah? In this text in Philippians chapter 3. Paul takes issue with what these Jewish Christians are doing and saying, listen, he's warning the church. He's giving out this warning. He says, listen, they think they're doing something really, really good involving circumcision, but it's wrong, and the end result is destruction and mutilation. That's the message we're getting. Beware of those dogs who are trying to make you do things to get right with God. No. It doesn't work that way. We put our confidence in Jesus alone. And it's only by Jesus' affection of us that makes us right with him. So that's the first part. All right, that's part one. Now we're going to go on to part two. We're going to go on to some ancient history. And we need to go back in time a little bit because I think it unpacks a little bit more. There's some more depth of what actually is happening here with the circumcision thing. So we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. This is a famous, famous passage, one of my favorites in the Old Testament. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all people on earth will be blessed through you." So up until this time in the story of humanity on earth, things had kind of not been going that well. We had had the flood experience. People had sort of gone off the rails. They hadn't lived the way that God wanted them to live. They had not been making the choices that he had designed them to, right? You guys are with me? Right? Things had not been going super, super well with humanity. It was all sort of unraveling pretty quickly. Humans had sort of turned out to be a pretty vengeful, petty, small, narrow, judgmental bunch, right? Nothing unlike we are, nothing like where we are today, right? Just they were really bad then. We've improved since. So luckily, in the story in Genesis, God doesn't abandon us. Right? He doesn't just burn the thing up. He doesn't zap the world out of existence and go start over somewhere else. He doesn't do that. Rather than he doesn't write us off and leave us. He doesn't do any of those things. Instead, he chooses to engage, to enter in, to go in deeper, to connect more. And at this stage of the story, he does something that might seem crazy given the circumstances. He chooses to partner with these very people that have made such poor decisions from day one. So he chooses to partner with them, and he chooses to invite them to take part in his missionary endeavor on the planet. Are you with me? And that's what this conversation with Abram is all about. Listen, he says, listen, Abram, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. I'm going to make you famous. I'm going to make you rich. Things are going to go really, really well for you, Abraham, God says. But he says, listen, but it's not for you. It's not about you. I'm not making you rich and famous. I'm not doing all this stuff. I'm not blessing you so that you can feel super wonderful about yourself. I'm actually doing it because you're going to become a great nation. And in fact, many generations of people will receive the blessing that I'm giving to you because of what I'm doing in your life. Yeah? You with me? Right? I will make your name great, and I will make you a great nation, and they will be blessed, right? But then God says, listen, but it's not even about them. It's not even about that. Sure, they're going to be blessed. There's going to be all these people that will come from you, and they will all be blessed because of your faith in me. But it's not only about them. It's not about them. It's actually about the whole world. It's not about you guys feeling superior and better than anyone else. The reason that you're being blessed is that you might be blessed every person on the entire planet. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless your tribe. And through your tribe, I'm going to bless everyone. I think what God is saying in this passage in Genesis chapter 12 is, I think God is saying, Abraham, I want you to join the resistance movement. I want you to join my resistance movement to what is happening. Stuff is unraveling. Stuff is not going very well, right? I want you to join me in my resistance movement on this planet. And in fact, Abraham really got it. And so God says, listen, through you, all people are going to know my love for humanity. Through you, I'm going to communicate to every person that I love them exactly as they are. Through you, I'm going to restore all things. Through you, Abraham, you're with me? Through you, I'm going to throw open doors wide to all people. Yeah? You're going to join me in making my love known in the world. And so if we were to read ahead in Genesis chapter 17, where Abraham circumcises himself and all the other males in his household, we might begin to understand and recognize that act was a sign of spiritual and tribal identity. They had joined God's resistance. And this was a sign. We are blessed by God so that we can bless all people. We are part of the revolution. We are pushing back against what is happening here on this planet. We are joining with God in his missionary endeavor. We are joining God in fixing this thing. And we are so serious about it that we're going to do this crazy, delicate, and personal ritual to demonstrate how serious we are about joining God. It'll be a sign between us and God. So there's the history. Now, let's go back and put those together. Put it together a little bit. Paul writes in Philippians chapter 3, verse 2, beware of those dogs, those evildoers, those mutilators of the flesh. He speaks that into a situation, into a context where we have Jewish Christians, right, who have been invited for centuries, for millennia, to join God in his missionary resistance, to fling wide open the doors to God for all people to be blessed themselves so that they might bless the whole world, right? So we have these people. They've been at this for centuries. They've joined God's resistance movement. These Jewish Christians, right? They've signed up and they've done this crazy sign, right? I'm gonna hang it here. There we go. So they've done this sign and they've taken on this thing, right? This kind of nuts ritual to show how serious they are about joining God in his mission. And what they have done, these Jewish Christians they've taken this sign to signify them opening the doors wide for people. They have now taken this sign and they are now using it to block people from getting through the door in the first place. No wonder it made Paul crazy. This is insane. This is the exact opposite of what the whole point was. These Jewish Christians are now using this sign of allegiance, that we are part of God's resistance movement in the world. We are part of the way that we're going to spread God's blessing and fling open doors wide to all people for God. They are now using that to keep all people from going through the door. It's crazy. No. You got to do this thing. In order to get the blessing from God, you got to be a part of us. You got to join our tribe. You got to join our group. If you want the blessing, you got to be with us. And it makes Paul insane. It just makes him crazy. If you read what he says in Galatians about this subject, you can't say it in church. I mean, it's like if you read it, I mean, he uses cuss words and everything in the Greek in Galatians. It is very, very strong language, and it's all about this subject. It makes him crazy. The people could imagine that they could use this sign, this indicator of joining God's resistance as a way of preventing that whole thing from happening. It's nuts. And so Paul says, no, in Philippians chapter 3. You're missing the point. No. We brag only about Jesus, he says. We're only proud. Everything we do, however right it is, it's garbage. It's trash compared to knowing Jesus. And that's true for upsiders and outsiders and insiders and downsiders, every single one of us. You know, this past week, some of us watched there's a YouTube video going around on Facebook. I saw it on social media, a short, 10-minute short about the evacuation of people from Manhattan on 9/11. There's a sea evacuation. If you haven't heard the story, it's the largest sea evacuation ever. It was bigger than Dunkirk. Just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people evacuated by ship off of Manhattan Island. You know, on the day of the attack, the bridges were all closed, the tunnels were closed, and people naturally gravitated south, and then they were just trapped against the water. And so the Coast Guard put out this call: anybody who has a boat, come help out. And thousands of people with boats drove boats into the night, exiting people off the island. And, you know, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, man, it's sort of, you know, what Paul is talking about is sort of like, you know, if those boat drivers showed up on the beach there or on the pier in Manhattan and said, oh, no, you guys don't have a captain outfit on. In order to ride the boat, you got to have a captain outfit. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm here to help, but I mean, you got to have the outfit. I mean, I have the outfit. All my guys here have the outfit. You got to have the outfit in order to get on the boat. No, it'd be insane. It'd be crazy. It'd be nuts. What if that happened? I mean, if that happened, we can't fathom how anything like that could possibly happen. No, the beauty and the amazement of that moment where everyone is welcomed, everyone is helped out, regardless of who they are or how disabled. I mean, some of the most amazing stories from that day were about how they got people onto the boats who had a hard time getting around or who couldn't communicate well or whatever. I mean, it's crazy. There were no admission fees whatsoever. People were helpless, and they were there to help. Of course, we see this dynamic all the time today in religions and in churches where we couch tribal language, we couch tribal markers of identity in sort of gospel church, Jesus, salvation kind of language. We kind of build it up, and we make it seem like it's bigger than it is. And so rather than letting our markers of allegiance be what they are, as important signs of how serious we are about joining God in the world, we use them as markers to keep people out. Right? And it's not just about circumcision. We do it with all kinds of different issues. We do it with what version of the Bible you could substitute in literally any religious ritual or any kind of commitment that any of us makes. Oh, you pray like that? Mercy. You say those words? Sorry. That kind of makes you a tier 2 follower, right? And I think we have a picture of this. You know, what? You listen to that kind of music? Oh, we skipped this one. Sorry, go to the next one. I threw you off. What? You listen to that kind of music? And you call it worship? You listen to that in church? Oh, forget it. The door is locked for people like you. Oh, really? You ate that for breakfast? You drank that? You put that in your body? You go to school there? Ooh, you went to church on that day? You wear that? You put what on your face? Ooh, sorry. You can know Jesus, but just one step down. I hate to be the one to tell you this, but you know, the door is kind of locked for you right now. But listen, I can tell you how to get it open. I can tell you all you got to do is this thing, right? We've all seen and heard this, right? And here in Philippians, Paul says, beware of those dogs. Beware of those dogs who use tribal signs of identity to exclude people from God's universal mission in the world. He says, watch out, be on guard, steer clear, right? So there's the pieces. We've put them together, right? And now we're going to have a twist. One final twist before we're done. And this one is from scholars that are much smarter than I, but I think it's genius and valuable. The Greek word, again, we're going to go Greek again. I'm sorry if your eyes glaze over when you see Greek, but there's a Greek word. It's called blepeta, and it's the word here that's translated to see or to watch out for, to be on guard, right? And at its root, like if you take a class in Greek, you learn that blepeta means to see. That's just what blepo is, the original form of it. But that's what you do. You learn it, and it's to see. It's about seeing. And what many scholars say is that the way that it's constructed, the construction, the combination of different words right here in Philippians, that this construction is never translated to see anywhere else in the New Testament. So this construction, it happens many times. It's a very common construction. It's complicated, but with this certain combination of words and the case and just the form that it comes in, happens many, many times throughout the New Testament, and none of those other times is it translated "watch out for" or "be on guard for" or to see in that way. It's not. It doesn't carry that idea. And so when we read it here, and we read it, watch out for, we sort of get the impression that Paul is saying to us, listen, you need to watch out. There's those nasty, evil, legalistic dogs out there, and they're going to destroy, and they're going to judge, and you need to be on guard for them, and you need to fight back against them. That's kind of the vibe that I get, right? That's sort of where we've driven at the whole time. That's sort of the message. And what many scholars say is, no. This word here with this construction, it's never translated that way anywhere else in the New Testament. It doesn't carry that connotation here. It means something different. In fact, here, the way that we always translate this construction is, would you look at that? Have a look at that. Did you notice what was happening over there? Take a look at that. You might be able to learn something from that. It's not a harsh, judgmental warning. It's a, well, that's interesting. It's interesting you use that to keep people, there's much more curiosity. And in other words, what Paul is doing here isn't so much trying to get the Philippians to be all riled up about these legalists so that they can go to war with them. That's not what he's trying to do there. Instead, he's not warning the Philippian church to go and hunt down these crazy Jews who are trying to get people to do these rituals. He's not giving them a warning like that. He's saying, watch for that. Take notice of what's happening, because it might happen inside you. How do I make people feel like an outsider because of my deep commitments? Beautiful, important commitments that fill my life with meaning that I would never give up. But are there ways in which I let my own dedication, my own commitments, make people feel sidelined and exclusioned? Paul says, watch out for those dogs because they might be in you. Beware of this dynamic. Beware, watch out about trying to allow yourself to think that you're better than someone else. Watch out for this spirit of superiority in your own life. Watch out for the feeling of thinking that your tribe is better than everyone else's, right? Take notice of this. Walk circumspectly. Look for this dynamic in your life. Be careful not to slip into that attitude. You have been invited by God to join his resistance movement. You have been invited by God to join him in his process of blessing all people everywhere, Always. You have been, and you will take signs, and you will make commitments, and you will dedicate yourself, and that will look like a certain set of behaviors. Be sure not to use that as a barrier to that blessing taking place in your life. Watch out. Don't let your good-intentioned signs of allegiance become barriers to the kingdom of God. And whether that's Sabbath, or eating healthy food, or not drinking alcohol, or being generous, or worshiping all things that I personally commit my life to, whatever it happens to be, don't let those signs of allegiance become barriers for other people, where we make people feel like the door is locked for them, or they have to do this or that or anything to get inside the door. Paul says, beware of those dogs. Don't create a culture where people feel like they have to drive a certain car, be able to give it a certain level, or do whatever in order to enter the door. The other day I was in our gorgeous facility right here on Brookside. And if you don't know, if you're a visitor here or you haven't been around the facility, there's 3 buildings, right? There's this building, the auditorium, and there's the sanctuary. It's the next building over, so we're going to worship in about 15 minutes, and we're going to be done really soon because I have to do the welcome over there in just a second. And then there's another building even further, this is the office building. And all 3 of these buildings are connected by a series of walkways on the ground level, and there's courtyards in between them, and it's really great and beautiful. But they're all 3 also connected by an upstairs walkway. And there's actually an elevator right over here in this room so that you can, if you have mobility challenges, you can get to all 3 of these buildings via elevator. It's really amazing. And one of the things that I've discovered is that there's an upper walkway. I have a picture of it right here. There's an upper walkway, and you go out of one door, and some of you know where I'm going with this. You go out of one door, and then you go into another door on the other end. And one of the things you might discover, should you be up there at some point during the day, not on a Sabbath, because on Sabbaths they're totally unlocked, which is what they should be. However, if you go up there during the week or after hours, what you might discover is that there are no keyholes on the outside of either one of those doors. And so theoretically, if you were new to the church, if you were like a new staff member here, and you happen to wander up there without your phone and without your keys, you'd just be locked out. Theoretically. And that happened to me. I've heard it happens. I've heard a story about somebody who it happened to, like a kid. They were up there for a long time, and like the parents were looking for them, and they were just up on. And is there another story I've heard? Maybe anyway. This is a total rabbit trail, but seems like I heard someone like got hurt because they got stuck up there and they had to jump off or something. Anyway, you can get stuck up there, so watch out when you are up there. But I can tell you, when I was up there, I was locked out of the door. I was locked out of the door. And you know, it feels frustrating and helpless to be locked out. In this case, it wasn't locked out in the cold, it was locked out in the heat. But there's nothing you can do. All you can do when you're locked out is to wait for someone to come open it and let you in. Right? That's all you can do. You can just sit around and wait. You don't have control about when that's going to happen or how it's going to happen or who's going to open it. You just are there. And you know, if someone locked you out on purpose, then it takes on a whole other set of feelings. You don't just feel powerless or out of control, but you may feel ashamed or embarrassed or abandoned or lonely. It comes with a whole other layer of rejection. Last week on Facebook, I shared another picture of the same facility. And some of you have seen this when you've walked up to the church on a Sabbath morning. The doors of this building right out here on the sidewalk flung open wide. What a contrast. I had a conversation with some church members this week about how this building and those doors and the way they're oriented, it was very intentional architecturally. We built this in such a way because of our desire as a congregation to be inclusive and welcoming and open to people in our community. And on Sabbath mornings, I haven't come yet on a Sabbath morning where those doors were not wide open. It's very intentional. We want to be a people that are inclusive and welcoming of all. Same building, but when I walk up to those open doors on a Sabbath morning, the feeling of warmth, the feeling of welcome, the feeling of you are wanted here no matter what. You are loved and accepted exactly as you are. What an amazing difference. Same building, same space, but completely different relationship. I don't know about you, but I want to be a person that opens wide those doors. Put that back on there. I want to be a part of the resistance movement. I may drag around a sign. I may commit because I'm serious about it. But I want to be someone that drags over, that flings open doors wide to God's radical love. And I want to invite you to join me in that. Let's pray. Dear Jesus, I'm in your debt because you love and accepted and called me exactly as I am, in spite of my faults and my failures, in spite of my bad habits and mistakes, in spite of the ways that I do not and have not represented you as you are. And there are many others in this room who feel the same, who feel in awe of your grace, of your unconditional, unbelievable, outstanding love. And our God, many of us have committed ourselves to following you, to being a part of your work in the world, to making the world a better place, to welcoming your kingdom. And many of us have made significant sacrifices in our lives, whether it's not working one day a week or giving generously or giving our time or not eating or drinking certain things or whatever. Many of us here in this room have given ourselves, have committed ourselves because we are committed to you, and we want to show it. And dear Jesus, I pray that you give us wisdom and courage and self-awareness that we might follow Paul's warning in Philippians. May we not use our commitments to you as barriers to the very thing that you've called us to. Dear Jesus, please help us to be inclusive and open and welcoming and loving. Please help us to be agents of your love in this world. And Jesus, please help us to trust you and to trust your way, that it's love, that it's kindness that draws people to you. I pray that you walk with us, walk with this congregation. May we be your hands and feet in Redlands and beyond. Amen. All right, so we are back at it, back from the sermon. There it was, 42 minutes long, a little bit longer than I had hoped, but that's what it is. That's how it rolls out sometimes. Our next segment, the second segment of the show, is called Microphone Therapist, and obviously I am primed to unload a little bit and process what had happened in that sermon. But the Microphone Therapist is a segment of the show where it's an invitation, or it's an invitation for me to invite myself to talk about myself. There you go. But really, it's a moment for me to share a little bit about how I felt about this thing. How did I feel before and during it and after it, and what were my favorite parts and what were my least favorite parts, and just for me to unload. And this is consistently the longest segment of the show, and also the one that I probably enjoy the most. So how did I feel about it? Well, I have to tell you that my dominant feeling about this particular sermon is one of excitement when I get to share it. This is not the first time, as I mentioned, that I've preached this particular message. It's actually not even the second time. I've taken this one on the road, if you will. It's one that it's in a very, very close alignment with my own heart. I love the message of this sermon. I love. I love what it has to say, and it's what my life what I want my life to be about. That closing line of, I want to be someone who opens the door to God, to salvation, to self-acceptance, to love. I want to be that kind of person, and I, more than anything, I don't want to get in the way, and I don't want to do things that would block people from following God, and that's what my whole life is about. And so that this sermon is about that, I'm excited. I love to share it, and so excitement was one of those things. While it was happening, I felt a little bit weird and a little bit self-conscious about the sign. This is a sermon that I've had in the past. I've had it almost completely memorized. And in fact, there's been more than once where I've preached this particular message with just a loose outline, outline of where it had, like number one, da da da, and just like with one word, and that's all I needed to prompt myself to know what was next. And so I have done this one where I had a lot of recent practice, and so anyway, one of the outflows of having it a little bit less memorized than I would have ideally had. And I know I say this every single time on the show, like I haven't, and pretty soon your eyes are going to start glazing over when I talk about how I hadn't practiced enough. It's sort of like my wife Paige, when I tell her that, she just kind of rolls her eyes because she knows that I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, and I never think that I did it good enough. So, and I'm laughing because she's right. It's true. And I'm going to say it, just so you know, like, I'm going to say I didn't practice enough pretty much every time, even when I practiced a lot. So we'll see. You can hold me to that. And if at some point, that changes, but anyway, one of the outflows of that during the sermon itself was that, there's a point, and you can't, you only get it a little bit through the audio, but if you watch the video version, you'll see. But I have this large wood sign, and that's when I'm talking about joining the resistance movement. I have this large wood sign, and it has a piece of rope attached to it, and the sign has scrawled on it in gray paint, "Resist." And so I'm talking about the joining God's resistance movement and stuff, and so I actually put the sign on myself, and I like the imagery of that. There's some awkwardness with it. I have to juggle the thing, and I think that fits sort of with the idea that, like, we take on a sign of allegiance to God, and that sign probably will disrupt our lives, but because we are so serious about joining God in His work in the world, it's fine. We're okay with that. And so, so I think it fits. But anyway, it was sort of extra awkward this time because I had my iPad, which had my notes on it, and I was a little more tied to my notes. And this is where I was heading with this comment is in that moment when I like have this sign around my neck and I'm like trying to look at my notes and I can't. And I felt a little uncomfortable on the stage, a little bit too aware of my need for my notes. I didn't really like that feeling. There was one point fairly early on in the sermon where I joked about, or I tried to joke. Apparently it was, I still feel like I don't know, I think it's funny, but anyway, maybe it hit too close to home, or maybe I don't really know. I don't know, but it didn't really seem to go over. But I joked about how my subject is circumcision, and I'm speaking about circumcision at a worship service that is called Relevant. And so I sort of tried to joke about that, at least to me, circumcision doesn't seem like a particularly, relevant topic in today's age, but maybe it is. And maybe I was, falling into a ditch by making that comment. But, anyway, nobody laughed. At least as far as I could tell, nobody laughed, and except for me. And so that was sort of a self-conscious, awkward moment during the sermon. Um, Favorite parts about the thing. I like I mentioned, I love the imagery on stage. I loved the door, the physical door. I loved the sign. I love how the sign becomes a physical barrier to the door. I love how those two things interact in the sermon. It's just such, it's a powerful, powerful thing to me. So I just love the metaphor of it. I love the energy of it. It works really, really well. And I like I said, I'm not sure how well I did it because I wasn't super practiced on this particular one, but I love that concept of how a sign, how my commitment, my allegiance to God can become a barrier for other people. And I think Paul talks about this in Romans. The book of Romans. He talks about, especially when it comes to food, is sort of the subject matter. But I think the principle goes far beyond that. But the Apostle Paul, he talks about how don't be a stumbling block. Don't let what is okay for me, don't let what is an expression of faith for me become a barrier, a hindrance to other people. And we need to be empathetic to the journeys and paths of other people. And so, if my commitment to keeping Sabbath, for example, becomes something that blocks someone else from even approaching God, it's a problem. It's a problem, and I think that's sort of the whole thing. Like in this whole passage, I don't think that we hear or see Paul speaking badly per se against the practice of circumcision. He wasn't saying don't ever do this, but he was saying, if you're doing it in order to be right with God, you're kind of missing the point. And if you're insisting that other people join in on this, again, you're missing the point. So anyway, I love the physical. I love having those props on stage and how they interacted and how they illustrated the concept without even necessarily talking a whole lot about it. I like the fake dialogues. I had this one scenario that I set up with the people, the happy missionaries, the people knocking on the doors and saying, "Hey, we're glad you're following Jesus, and we want you to know that you're not good enough." I really like those dialogues, and anyway, I think it's fun. But and I was thinking to myself this morning as I was working on the notes for the podcast, I was thinking it could be fun to I could hand those off. We have so many actors in this particular congregation. I'm sure I could hand some of those dialogues off and sort of throw it to some other people during the sermon. I know that we've talked already about, sort of the risks that can come or, with dividing the sermon up. But I love involving other people, and often I feel like it's worth the risk of disjoining the sermon or kind of messing up with the flow or whatever. But that's something that I thought about incorporating in the future. And another thing I liked about the sermon, and I have a lot of things that I like. Sue me, all right? So I do have 3 things that I didn't like as much, all right? So we'll get to those. But another thing that I really liked is I liked the organization of it. Like I've said many times, I think that giving sort of a preview or an arc of, hey, this is where we're headed. I think that it helps to sort of put people at ease. And I also liked in this particular one that I told them where we were going, but I didn't tell them where we were going. And if you look on the video, you'll see that the section 4 was I told them that we were going to there would be a twist. And the twist really was the whole point of the sermon. But in order to get that, we had to do all the stuff before. But the picture for the twist was a banana. So if you imagine a partway peeled banana, but instead of a banana where the fruit would have been, it was like a sliced up piece of sausage, right? Like a pepperoni stick or something. And so anyway, just the twist, and I think that captures. So I liked giving that preview, and then we referred back to that preview slide all through the sermon, so that people would sort of know where we were at. along the way. Finally, I really love the Abraham piece. You know, I had this section in the middle. I think it was section 2 of the sermon, the ancient history thing. We went back to Genesis chapter 12 and talked about Abraham and Abram at the time, Abram's calling, and sort of this idea that God was inviting Abram to join him in his mission in the world. And I love that concept, and I think it's so freeing and interesting and beautiful and useful, and I think it's endless, full of power. That idea that God invites us to partner with Him in the work that He's doing, and I get excited about that, and I love just all kinds of different ideas about that. Like, I think that many people are partnering with God in His healing mission in the world who may not even believe in God, or may not even realize that they're partnering with Him, or may take issue with me saying that they are partnering with Him, but I believe that they are, and I think that we can be about God's work in surprising ways, and I think that surprising people or people that we might not expect can be about God's work, and it's just super cool. And this concept that God's blessing to Israel was for a greater purpose, that they might bless the whole world. It's something that we talked about and studied a little bit in my master's program, and it's something that I've not forgotten. I'm looking over on my bookshelf, and one of the books that we read in my coursework was, I think it's by Glasser, Arthur Glasser. It's all about the kingdom, the gospel of the it's called Announcing the Kingdom by Glasser, and it's all about God's mission in the world, and he has this kind of reference that of the scope of God's mission, that it's to all people, all nations, everywhere. And we get to join him in that. And I think it's a powerful idea, and I love that I got to preach about that. Okay, so parts that I didn't like, and we'll blast through this quick. There's a really, really long text reading at the beginning of the sermon. And again, I think it was an opportunity to involve someone else in the sermon. It could have been a scripture reading or whatever. I failed to do that this week. I feel bad about it. I didn't think about it until too late in the game. And if I would have just spoken up on, Tuesday when we were working on planning the worship service, it could have worked out just fine. But anyway, I think it just was it felt a little bit weird having it at the very, very beginning. And it was probably, I don't know, you could go back and listen. It was probably a minute long or a minute and a half long reading. So it was long. And I think it may have potentially helped the sermon had someone else read it and not me. But also, it would have been great it was just an opportunity to involve someone else on the platform. Something else, I don't know if I could say that I didn't like this, but I don't like the feeling of it. It felt sort of like being on dangerous ground, especially the initial application that I made, which is, I'm talking about how Christian practice interacts and relates with salvation or being right with God. And that's always sort of a dangerous thing, because there are always going to be people for whom certain practices, they just identify them with really, really, really strongly, or they feel really, really, really uptight or intense about it. And so if someone says, well, that we don't do that in order to be saved, or God doesn't require that you do that in order to be saved, they might freak out, and that's a little bit scary for a pastor. So I don't really like that feeling. So as a preacher, I always feel that there's a balance between sort of pushing people and helping them feel a little bit uncomfortable, but also the risk of challenging entire faith systems, and that's not something I want to do. I don't want to lead people into a situation where they are questioning everything. That's not my goal. I want to strengthen, and sometimes strengthen means giving resistance to preconceived ideas and whatnot. But it's always an uncomfortable place for me to be in, which is why I don't like it. But like I said, I think that it's important. And in this particular sermon, I didn't spell out a lot of the practical application of it very well, and I'm probably not spelling it out right now, right now in the moment. But what does this actually look like in real life? A few weeks ago, I talked about an experience that I had where I was working with an evangelist who refused to baptize someone who had not yet given up smoking. They smoked cigarettes for their whole life, and they're really, really trying to quit. And generally, in my tradition, in the Adventist denomination, smoking is something that's sort of looked down upon. That's probably to say it gently. In some circles, it's outright condemned. It's taboo. And then in other circles, it's a little more open. It just sort of depends on which community that you're a part of. But generally, it's something that Adventists, Adventists encourage people to stop when they become Adventists. And so anyway, I had this experience where this evangelist refused to baptize a lady who wasn't able to quit. And she, in concept, she was committed. She agreed. She knew that it wasn't healthy and she didn't want to smoke, but it was an addiction and she was trying really hard and she just couldn't do it. That's for me, that would be an application of this, where it's like, yes, I feel committed. For me, that quitting smoking is a sign that I am joining with God and His mission in the world, and to not be, to like have the door shut on you over that, to have the church say, no, you can't be with God because you haven't put this thing together. That to me, I feel like it's wrong. It's wrong. I don't think it's okay. And but the more specific that a preacher gets, like this example about smoking, and I think you could substitute in any other number of like lifestyle issues or practices or whatever, from drinking alcohol or eating certain foods or Sabbath observance or whatever in this tribe, or in other tribes it could be speaking in tongues, or having healing miracles happen around you, or having a certain political ideology or whatever. The more specific you get as a preacher, the more scary and dangerous it becomes. So it feels a little bit safer to sort of stay on that theoretical level. But then I feel like the risk as a preacher is, if I don't apply it, if I don't sort of shape or explain how this actually looks in real life, then people listening might not get it. And so it's part of the plight. It's part of the plight of being a preacher, and it can be an uncomfortable place. So I was definitely there. Finally, a piece that I didn't like very much is, I've talked before, and I probably will mention this again, is I think it's helpful and useful to make reference to, current events, things that are happening in the lives of people in the church, things that are happening just in the world. And of course, this past week we had the anniversary of 9/11, 2001, the 9/11 attacks. And there's a video that I saw going around social media about the boat evacuation. And so I think that what I did with it in the sermon, I think that it works, and I think that it makes sense, but I didn't take enough time to really develop it. And what it was driving at is sort of this idea that it's sort of about salvation. We want to save you, we want to help you, but you have to give up whatever. And I didn't sort of explain it very widely, like the idea that the church is the boat and we are the boat driver, and blah. I didn't. It was sort of rushed, and I think that that was an illustration that I added this week. There wasn't in prior versions of the sermon, there was no illustration there. So I think it added some length, and I think because it added some length, I didn't feel like I had the time to really flesh it out a lot, and so I didn't. anyway, I don't think that it worked that well, even though I had good intentions. And I don't know if I'll use it in that place again, or if I'll just blast through. But I wasn't entirely comfortable. I mean, it's a super powerful, just remarkable story. If you haven't heard it, if you haven't watched that YouTube video, I'll put a link in the show notes for it. It's really an amazing story. And I fear that I don't want to dishonor those people, dishonor the stories, dishonor the families of people who lost loved ones. I'm guessing that there were people maybe even injured and hurt who were a part of that evacuation. And so I hope that I didn't trivialize that experience. All right. The third segment of our show is called Killing Your Darlings. Killing your darlings. And we don't want to kill anyone. But in writing circles and editorial circles, there's this phrase, killing your darlings. And it's all about, anything that does not help move the plot along, anything that does not help support what you're trying to do. It's got to be cut, even if you love it, even if it's dear to your heart, even if it's darling. And so this segment of our show is talking about what we left out, what did I not share, even if I thought it was great. And in this case, one of the things that I decided to leave out is this piece on being a perfectionist parent. In the original sermon, I talked about summer camp at this point, and I talked about how we had these room inspections and about how kids would end up not being invited to the pool party because they had some nitpicky inspector. And I probably should have just kept that, but in a way that this is the section where the 9/11 thing came in, and I don't know. I really do think that it worked, but it was a summer camp up north, which was nearby and very familiar to all the people in the audiences up in Washington State, and would not have been as familiar down here and in Southern California. And so, I took the camp one out, and I thought about inserting this parenting one instead, and sort of talking about how you can be a perfectionist parent and nitpick all the little details, and you can be on top of your kids all the time, or you can, as I think many of us, at least I do, like you have to choose what your battles are going to be, and you have to let a lot of stuff go and relax about certain things, and then address and tackle more difficult things. And that's just part of the deal. And we do that because we want to help them. We want them to grow, and we want to maintain a relationship. And something similar is true when it comes to spiritual growth, or as people relate to church. If we're like nitpicking about everything, it's not going to work. So anyway, that was something that I left out, and it's something I believe, and it's true. I just don't know if it helped the plot along. I had I mentioned earlier in the show that I didn't feel like I was super strong on the application part of what spiritual practices or Christian practices or whatever are we even talking about here. And I had this story I was thinking about sharing about this man that I met when I was pastoring in Yakima. I met him at the fair, and he had this booth. And the booth at the fair was all about how you should only read the King James version of the Bible, right? You should only read the King James version of the Bible, and how any other version, you're going to go to hell if you read it. And so I was going to use that as kind of a practical application, but I didn't end up using it, partly because of time, and also partly because I in this case it wasn't because of fear of exposure, because that's something that I don't agree with that person on that point of view, but neither does my spiritual tribe, and neither does most of the people in our congregation. I don't think so. I don't think that would be a very dangerous place to be in. But it felt like a rabbit trail where like I'd start people down this other line of thought. And, as a preacher, there are times when there may be something that's interesting, or maybe something that you like, but if you start talking about it, you might lose people's train of thought on, the main point that you're making. There might be a time where you as a preacher are tempted to talk about a certain political candidate or a certain hot button issue, like carrying weapons in church or something. And if talking about that is really, really important to getting the idea of the sermon across, or if that's like the outflow and the application of it, then by all means. But if it's like a side comment, you're going to hurt the overall message of the thing, because people are going to be thinking about that issue, and they're going to start thinking about, well, what do they think about it? What are they, or do they agree with me, or do they not agree? And that's a fine thing to have them thinking if that's the point of the sermon. But if you start getting them thinking about politics, and the point of your sermon is about volunteering at the homeless shelter, like. You're gonna lose them. You're gonna lose them, and the point in the end, you're not gonna get the impact that you might have otherwise. So the Yakima thing, the Bible King James Version thing, that was a casualty for that reason. Finally, I had a little bit of a discussion worked up about the use of reversals in Hebrew literature, and this is something I'm not an expert about. So maybe I felt a little like I didn't have the authority to say it. It's not really a darling. This isn't something that I was like in love with. But there's different ways that chiasm is used, especially in ancient literature. It's can be done grammatically within sentences where you have symmetry, or where things repeat themselves in different ways. But there also is sort of a form of chiasm that happens within the story itself, where and it's often called a reversal, where some bad situation is introduced, and by the end of the story it has become good, or where a good situation is introduced, and by the end of the story it becomes really bad. And I had this discussion where I was talking about the 3 Greek words, and I'm going to talk about those 3 Greek words in the next section of the podcast, but Paul sort of uses each of them as reversals. He reverses the meaning, and he uses these terms that are often used by religious insiders to talk about outsiders in a derogatory way, and he takes hold of them, he commandeers them, and uses them to talk about insiders. It's this reversal thing, and it's a sort of a common, Hebrew literary form. But I didn't feel like talking about all of that really supported it, and like I'm going to say in just a moment, I don't know how much even talking about those Greek words helped the whole thing in general. So anyway, those are some things I left out of this particular sermon, and let's go on to the next section. The next section of the show is called Wisdom is the Act of Thinking Something Stupid and Not Saying It. It is the longest title of any segment of our show. And it's all about asking, what did I learn? How did I gain wisdom? If I had it to do over again, what would I change? How would I apply it? And like I said, there's a section, it's in the beginning, it's in the first part of this sermon, and it's all about these 3 Greek words, kunas, kaukos ergotas, and katatomein. And, I think that there's always a risk of doing Greek word or Hebrew word overload in a sermon. And I think that it can be useful to speak about it once or twice, but it's sort of there's kind of a meme amongst preachers that new young preachers overuse word studies, and they drag out the Greek words too often. And, that it's exciting for those of us that study the languages, and, whenever you get through college and you're new with it, it's great, but it can kind of be overused. So I always have that in the back of my mind whenever I drag out the Greek words, and I don't do it super frequently, but this one actually had these 3 Greek words all together in one section, and then I referenced another Greek word at the end of the sermon, and that was actually super important to the arc of the sermon in general. That was kind of the driving point, so I needed to keep that one. But this first section, the first section of the sermon, I think felt really long to me. And if you were to look at the notes on pages, it was probably double the length of all the other sections. And, one of the reasons that it was drawn out is because of these talking about these three Greek words, and so I wonder to myself, like, could I have accomplished the same thing by leaving them out? Could I have summarized them more? Could I have just said, in one sentence, say, Paul uses these words that are commonly used to signify outsiders, and he uses them against the insiders, and he's turning the tables on them, and he's switching it around, and I don't know. It may have had the same amount of punch as going into detail. One of the things that we as preachers we ask ourselves, or at least I ask myself, is I try to think about, like, what is the relative biblical literacy of people in my audience. Am I speaking to people who have a certain amount of fluency in the Bible, or are these the people I'm speaking to people who for them it's pretty new stuff, new material, and are they going to be lost if I assume that they know what Hebrew is or what Greek is? And I worry about that a little bit with the show, with this podcast in general. I think sometimes religious services can have like a lot of insider coded language that if you're not familiar, it might just sound like gibberish. So it's something that I think about frequently. And as a preacher, I like to give little orientations and sort of help people on the way. So when I say, Paul wrote blah, 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 it's more useful to say, there's an early Christian leader named Paul, and he had this long history, and he wrote a number of letters to different churches in the area that he lived in, and he gave them advice, and so this guy, Paul, he's sort of famous in the Christian world, and he wrote blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, for someone who's familiar with Paul, that first introduction, Paul wrote, is enough. But for a lot of people, and maybe even the majority of people, having that little bit of context is super helpful. And I mean, at least in my life and experience, I don't think that people generally are excited about saying, "Hey, I'm raising my hand. I don't know what you're talking about." People don't want to feel embarrassed or like they don't know enough. And so I like the feeling of including people by giving those things. And with something like, Greek words or whatever, it's sort of an opportunity to do that. But it might also be an opportunity to lose people. And so I don't know what the applied wisdom is other than be judicious about your use of original language words. Because this is a sermon that I've given before and given before a number of times, it's also been refined down quite a bit. And so in a lot of ways, this one has had a lot of applied wisdom given to it already, which is a great thing. I'm happy for that. And so anyway, it's sort of, I want to keep applying the changes that I wish I would have made and keep developing this one, because I think this is a sermon I'll actually preach again. The final segment of our show is all about feedback, and I've got a new title for it, and I like this one. It's called Intent v. Impact. Intent v. Impact, and it's all about what I was trying to do and how it actually came across. And so this is a time to talk about feedback that I've received, to invite further feedback. Just to try to make the podcast, just like I'm trying to make my own art of preaching improve, I want to see the podcast improve over time. So I had some great comments, some really sweet, kind comments from church members in the room this week after the sermon, which is always wonderful to get. A couple people mentioned, "Hey, you need to offer this one at the 11 o'clock worship service as well," and maybe I will sometime down the road. In fact, I think I probably will, despite the Mark sermon series coming up. But there'll be an opportunity to do that at some point. But that's always affirming and kind and sweet to hear people, clearly where the message connected with them and helped them. I mentioned at the very beginning and several times throughout that this was, in the worst possible way you could call it a rerun, but it was old work, an old sermon that I've used a number of times before, and there's a part of me that could worry about feedback from people saying, "Oh, you just preached some old thing, huh? You just drug it out of the closet, and you didn't even work very hard this week, and why didn't you do more for us?" And I kind of, and I know that that's my own criticism in my head. That's my own critic. I get, nobody was said that to me, but the reality is that because the sermon, I say at the beginning of every show, the sermon is a unique moment in time. It's a unique event. And I think that's true. It will never, that moment that I had this last weekend on the 14th, it will never be recreated. Even if I were to do the same sermon again in the same room with the same songs, it would be different because the weather would be different. Different events would have taken place in the world. Different things would have happened in people's lives. Almost certainly would have been a different crowd of people, a different mix of people in the room. There are so many different variables that go into the live speaking moment of giving a sermon, that each one is unique in time. It's like a living, breathing organism. And because of that, sermons can't just be plug and played. And if you do it, they're not going to be very good, and it's not going to be very helpful to people. If your goal, which is mine, which is to preach useful sermons and to help people in their lives with the material, you have to rework it for the audience that you're going to be giving it, which is why, I mentioned before that I didn't include the illustration about Camp Mivadin and the nitpicky room inspector. And it's because of this particular audience, and so I think that even though it is reusing old stuff, if you're doing it well, it's going to feel somewhat new no matter what. And of course, I'm a different person, and I'm a different preacher from when I first wrote this sermon. I think it was written maybe 4 years ago. I think 2012 or 13, or maybe it was more than 4 years ago. But anyway, I think that this sermon worked, and I think that my choice to preach it on this particular week was only reinforced by the positive feedback that I got. So, I may drag out some old material that's good from time to time and reuse it. I worked with a pastor for a number of years who preached the same sermon, like word for word, yearly. There was one particular weekend where this guy preached a sermon, the same sermon every single year. And I don't think, in all the years that we worked together, I don't think it got old. I think that it was powerful year after year after year. And so I think there's something cool about doing that. So anyway, thank you again, though, for your feedback, for your emails. I got a couple of emails that were helpful. And for example, the shape of this episode is in response to that feedback. So if you have feedback about, things that could be adjusted, segments that could be added or changed, I have a couple of ideas for segments that will roll out, that probably won't be regular segments, but they'll be special segments. But thank you so much for joining me. Thanks for sharing your ideas and opinions along the way. And it's so good to know that you're out there. One quick note before we close for good on this episode is that I am not preaching at all this next week. I get a week off. In my 3 months here at Redlands Church, or 4 months at Redlands Church so far, I've taken a couple of weeks off from preaching on the weekend. But this weekend is one of those where I'm going to take off. I have this spiritual retreat that's required by the denomination that I'm working for here. And it begins on Sunday. It doesn't begin on Saturday, but I'm trying to kind of lean into that retreat. And so I'm going to publish I'll publish a new episode next week with some commentary, but it'll be an old sermon. It might be one of the sermons from the Calling series or something like that. So do look for an episode, but it won't be one that I will have preached like the day before or whatever. So. But just a note about that. And then back on the 28th, we'll be back for sure, rolling through the book of Mark. So thank you so much for joining me on the show. Thanks for taking the time, spending the time with me. It is a gift, and I hope that it's useful for you and interesting and helpful in your life. If you would be willing to do me a favor, I would so appreciate it. Could you share this show, share this podcast on social media, share it with your friends, give me a signal boost. If you see me post on social media, When you see that, man, I would so appreciate if you would share it or like it or write a comment in it about it. It really helps for other people to discover. A big thing that I've heard of many times by different podcasters, I listen to a lot of podcasts, is leave a rating and a review for the show. Just give it a 5-star rating and say, hey, this is great. It helps other people to discover it. You can learn more about the show and get show notes and pictures and details and stuff on Inside the Sermon. The sermon. This was actually called Inside the Sermon at one point, but BehindTheSermon.com. BehindTheSermon.com. You can find all kinds of more information there. We are currently on iTunes, we are on Stitcher, we are on TuneIn. I have a friend who looked us up using the Android store. We're on there. We're all over the place. So anywhere you get podcasts, fine podcasts, you can find this one. Blessings to you. May you know that you are enough. You're loved exactly as you are. There is a place for you. There is hope for you. You will give and create and serve in beautiful, beautiful ways in this world. And I'm speaking that blessing over your life and mine right now. Thanks for joining us.